All right, good afternoon. All right, so let me get your names down. And we will begin, okay? So we're going over the progressive era. Hopefully you received my message about the due dates being the same for the next two assignments. All right, and getting late on posting the last one. Hope you guys are doing okay. And if you don't mind, whoever is iPhone 2, could you identify yourself so I can give you extra credit, please?
It's Dulce Lopez.
I'm sorry, what's your first name?
Dulce?
Dulce Lopez. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll join from my computer right now.
Okay, thank you. All
You're
right.
welcome.
Yeah, as long as I get your name now, and it's just the credit that I'm worried about. I want to make
Yeah,
sure you get
I'm
credit
sorry
for it.
about that.
No, it's okay. So at this point, it's no big deal. If you want to identify as iPhone 2, that's fine. All right, and so we give context to what's going on in the progressive era. And then the next assignment, we get more specified to the Latino experience, okay? So on this one, you see the beginnings of a movement, okay? What was somewhat rare about the progressive reform movement was that it was a movement from above. That doesn't happen too often in U.S. history, right? Oftentimes the squeaky wheels get the grease, right? And it's usually a disenfranchised, a marginalized, an exploited demographic in the population has had enough, and they force change, right? Some improvement to their situation. But when sometimes people would say that you need to be a little bit wary, a little bit suspicious when reform comes from above, from a well-to-do demographic, because that's exactly what happens here. All right. If you read the old historians like Richard Hofstadter, who's a big historian, was in his day, he identified them as the old upper middle class. The by old middle class, he says before the Industrial Revolution developed its own well-to-do middle class of middle management people and people connected to new technological improvements and so forth. The old well-to-do middle class were basically the intelligentsia. There were the few who had college education, had degrees and certifications to show for that were not found to be very prevalent in the U.S. population just yet. So a lot of them were lawyers, university professors, writers, editors and journalists for newspapers, etc. And so these people lived a pretty comfortable lifestyle, right? And very generically, they perceive certain problems during the Industrial Revolution, the second one, the main one that we had, right, during the Gilded Age, from the 1870s to the beginning of the 1900s. They perceive problems that have developed as as horrible byproducts of the second industrial revolution. All right. So what were some of those? For one, right, is they were supposedly alarmed about the growing disparity of wealth. You look at historians like Howard Zinn, and they eat this time up. This kind of fits their thesis, right, of capitalism being inherently parasitical, that for some people to win, others have to lose. And so you get a lot of mergers at this time. Many smaller mom and pop and modest scale businesses were merged, oftentimes forcefully, by big international corporations. You have also the fact that workers, we've already gone over this in the Gilded Age, according to Alan Brinkley, who's not a very radical historian at all, he doesn't take many chances in his arguments. He kind of stands in the middle of the road oftentimes, but even he contends that the average manual laborer, the member of the proletariat, right, Karl Marx's manual laboring class during the industrial era, was making well under $600 a year, which was seen as the bare minimum for subsistence to live off of. So people were finding 2-3 jobs and just desperate to make ends meet at this time in the late Gilded Age. So at any rate, they were alarmed by that. They were alarmed by the high instance of, we became number 1 in the world, Howard Zinn contends, in industrial accidents. So there were a lot of issues, safety issues in many of the factories. Okay, and then also they were worried about the combination amongst the workers, right, of malaise and of indignation. Okay, so the first one, malaise, right, is that some people just lost hope that their future was ever going to get any better. And so what do you know? You find where you have a lot of manual laboring industry in certain parts of the big cities of the country. You also have these strips of nightlife, taverns, saloons, bordellos, and these other amusements, right? And they found that in the local newspapers all over, especially in places like the infamous place in Manhattan Island of New York. I can't believe I'm forgetting the name. They had Hell's Kitchen. They had these different euphemisms to show how awful they were. The 5 points of New York City. You had just an inordinate a number of people who were patronizing these places, right? And if you're not making enough to live off of to begin with in your wages, and then you go and spend an inordinate percentage of those paltry wages on prostitutes, on alcohol, on animal fights, and these other types of amusement that they found in these kind of slum areas of the major cities, you're certainly not going to extricate yourself from poverty. You're only harming yourself. It's as if you've lost all hope and you've devolved into a life of vice. And of course, what are they trying to do? They're trying to find some type of immediate comfort, some type of escape from their misery of their lives. So they were concerned about that, those who were feeling the sense of malaise. And then also the indignation. You see this in some of the great railroad strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Pullman Strike of 1894, the Homestead Strike of 1892. These were bloody, with a lot of destruction of property. And they really took the well-to-do segment of the U.S. By surprise. Like I said, like going back to the Pullman one, a gentleman was told that he had to do a 3rd consecutive stint at his job, and he was exhausted. He'd already done 2, double time. He was already exhausted, and he said he's leaving. And he was told that if he left, don't bother coming back to the job, that it wasn't his. So he began walking up and down the lines of the railroad, telling people his story. And there already was great anger toward Mr. Pullman. He rose prices where people lived in his artificial little towns, and he paid them poorly, but yet he raised the rent, and he raised the amount of money to pay for utilities, etc. So there was already, there have been years of frustration. And so this was the spark that set it off. As he began walking up and down the railroad tracks, he began just accruing a large number of workers who walked off the job. And then in addition to that, they were stricken by how many people in other industries who did not even work for Mr. Pullman and his Palace Car Company of railroads joined this strike. And so there was a sense of like worker solidarity that scared the powers that be. And they were very quick to destroy property. They lit things on fire in the railroad cars and blew railroad cars up. They chased a group of patrolmen into a station and then lit the station on fire to kill them. I mean, it was bad. It was bloody. It was destructive, and it, like I said, I think it surprised many people just how much latent anger the poor manual laborers were feeling throughout the country. So at any rate, you have instances like that that greatly concerned the old middle class. All right. And so let's see here. You had the Bradley Martin Party. And this was supposedly you see this dress up party with $116 per plate. And that was back then. And this was during the 1893 Depression. So a young Teddy Roosevelt shows up as a chief of police there in New York. And he basically tells them, he says, "Are you mad? Are you crazy?" He said, "You're going to have an uprising on your hands, and the poor are going to come after you for this, out of envy and out of resentment that you have money to just waste profligately on such things when they're going hungry." So at any rate, going back to the movement, they decide to try to tackle this issue of the problems of the Industrial Revolution. All right. So they used a theory called countervailing balance theory. And the idea is that every faction in the US, remember, a faction is a group that shares the same self-interest and or the same ideology, outlook on things. That when you look at society, there should be a relative balance of factions. And what they saw was that big business was overwhelmingly on that scale, metaphorically, they were too heavy. They were way too big, way too strong, way too powerful, way too much of a bully, enriching themselves at the expense of everyone else. And they were the weight that was much too heavy for any semblance of balance. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to increase the power of government, and they wanted to increase the power of the people to balance that weight of big business up and hold big business accountable. All right. So for some of them, the answer was in much better government regulation and of the economy. And so, for instance, you had those who wanted to put an end to the trusts. Remember, the trusts were when people like Rockefeller were combining their resources, combining the heads of their companies, their capital with another giant so that they could swallow up all the smaller competitors. And they were joining up in ways that just didn't seem fair. So the Sherman antitrust law had already been put into effect, that no illegal conspiracy shall be made in restraint of trade and competition. But it was vague and it was not enforced. So later we're going to get two presidents at the turn of the 1900s who are going to claim to be progressives as presidents. Okay. That will be Teddy or Theodore Roosevelt, and then two presidents later, Woodrow Wilson. Well, finally, that's going to be resolved somewhat under Woodrow Wilson's administration during the 19-teens, whereby they're going to state that with the Clayton Antitrust Act, they're going to give an exact, precise list of examples of violation of the antitrust law. So they give, now it's much more recognizable, definable, and able to be convicted, okay, because of the Clayton Antitrust Act. All right. You're going to have hatred and anger toward the railroads and their preferential treatment by getting subsidized by the federal government, right? Well, the railroads were charging whatever they want to whomever they want. And so the Interstate Commerce Act was created in 1887, and it said that their rates were to be reasonable and just, and that they were to be uniform, the same for everybody. But again, no one enforced that act until Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt comes in and he issues the Hepburn and the Elkins Acts. And now the railroads have to turn in paperwork to the federal government, and they get to see what the railroads are receiving, what they're spending money on, any type of white collar crimes that they're committing. They're to be on top of that. And then also they are to create an interstate commerce commission that actually will put a price ceiling on their rates, that over which they cannot go any higher in charging their rates. So he puts a little bit of meat into that Interstate Commerce Act as a so-called progressive president. You also had at the local levels, you had movements for health and safety within the industries, and also in housing. And so those both take off as well as new kind of reform movements by the progressives. And so you have, the beginning of housing codes, right? The hiring of inspectors to come and make sure that there are no fire hazards for collapse, for people falling out of windows, etc. Right? Now you have codes that began in New York and start spreading throughout the country. In addition to that, you have, of course, the famous the Federal Meat Inspection Act. And with that, under Teddy Roosevelt, the government creates the Food and Drug Administration. And now companies have to abide by national criteria for health and safety with things that are especially consumed or can be consumed by children. So at any rate, they get working on that. So now the companies have to stop. They have to make sure, they have to have inspectors come and make sure that they're in the factory. They have mechanisms to keep people from getting their shirts and their arms and sleeves caught in the machines and grinded with the meat, as sadly happened. Make sure see what exact type of chemicals they're putting in the food and all that. So that was another step forward made by the progressives as well. And so you have movements like this, right? But then more controversially is the progressives began moving into the social realm, right? Because let's face it, right? We've had libertarian thought in American political history from before the War for Independence from England, right? And remember, libertarian is government, don't tread on me, right? Just keep government as small and unobtrusive into your life as possible. And so for multiple generations, we as Americans thought, okay, the cultural or social realm of living, of life, is off limits for government. Government has no business to tell us we can or cannot drink alcohol or see a prostitute or something like that. But now the progressives, who are for, remember, bigger government involvement, they want to supposedly equip the less fortunate with the means to be able to be successful and rise up the socioeconomic ladder. So there were women like Jane Addams and a woman named Lillian Wald on the East Coast. And they started these settlement house projects. They would go into an ethnic enclave. Remember, an ethnic enclave is like a Chinatown, right? So in the case of Jane Addams in Chicago, a lot of them were Hungarian and Polish from Central Europe, immigrants. So she learned their languages. She celebrated their national holidays with them. They came in, they received free babysitting services. They received free classes and education. They were cleaned up. They could take showers and given clean clothes, etc. They had vocational classes to learn a trade, to be able to get involved in some type of trade and gain employment in a new job, right? They did that. They worked for sanitation and water and electricity accessibility for the poor people in these neighborhoods. They did that as well. Lillian Wald took the young boys, the young immigrant boys, and made deals of those immigrants who were in jail, and made a deal that she promised that she would reform them. And the local jails cooperated with her, and she took them out of jail, and she made them have a series of classes and schooling that they had to undergo. And they also had to do certain public works and charitable things. And they were kept busy, and they were supposedly being taught, right, kind of a lifestyle, an outlook that was very much synonymous with the lifestyle and outlook, at least the perceived one, of the old middle class, of the very people who were trying to reform them. Kind of like they were trying to make mini-me's of these immigrants, right? Saying, look, we're successful. We've been successful. Here's how you do it. And, become like us. So at any rate, you had Jane Addams was very famous for showing great respect for the immigrants in their diversity, in their own ethnic identity and national identity, etc. But not all of them are going to be like that, as you'll see. Some of them, it seems as if they were really almost coercively pushing assimilation on these immigrants, saying, become like us, drop all your ways, drop all your customs, and become like us. And a girl whose case is a case in point was a girl named Rahel Golub, Rahel, and then Golub. She was a Jewish girl from Russia, and she and her father came first. Her sister and her mom were still back in Russia. They had to literally gather enough money to pay the fare for her sister and mother to come next. Well, as she's working, she is not only working with with American girls at her job, at her daily job, but she's also going when she can into Lillian Wald's settlement house. And she's impressed by these reformers. She's impressed by the American girls that she works with. And they start giving her an idea that she could become successful like them. But she can't continue working in her manual laboring job. She needs to go to night school and get a degree. She needs to, supposedly it'd be better for her to become Christian because she's adheres to Judaism as a Jewish girl. And so finally, a couple incidents happen whereby one, she says, Dad, some of the girls at work are wanting to buy a nice dress, or they're wanting to go out with a little bit of their money. Could I keep just a fraction of my money that I give to you for such and such? And her dad was supposedly disgusted and said, your mom and sister are still living in misery back in Russia, and you want to buy yourself a dress? You know, how selfish of you. You're becoming like a typical selfish American girl. And then he also found a Bible that she brought home from the settlement house. So she wrote a diary, and it really it took the country's it grabbed the country's attention. It was published into a book, and it was kind of the epitome of the way that these immigrants felt They felt like torn, right? Because on the one hand, they wanted a better life. They saw these young girls, they saw these workers at the settlement house projects. They were so clean and well dressed. They were so educated and articulate. They seemed so successful and self-possessed and confident. And she longed for that for herself. But she also had a sense of obligation and loyalty to her family, and to not leave her family behind, and to not leave her family's culture behind. So at any rate, something to think about. And by the way, well, I'll get to it pretty soon. Then you also had Jacob Riis, and Jacob Riis was the guy who he was a Danish immigrant, and he fell through the cracks. He had the equivalent of a college education from Denmark, but no one cared, no one's noticed, and he was a manual laborer through like at least 4 different jobs, and he became an alcoholic. And he was discovered by a settlement house worker who brought him to a settlement house and had him take basically an aptitude test. And he found that Mr. Riis could read and write very well. And so he got him the settlement house connected to employers, and they got him a job working for a New York newspaper. Well, in order to kind of pay it forward for the help that he had received, the handout that he received, he began taking pictures and writing articles about the 5 points of New York and how awful the immigrants' conditions were, their living conditions were, living there. And so he turns it into a book filled with pictures known as How the Other Half Lives. And it shows like a stirring rebuke to how miserable the conditions were for poor immigrants. Okay. And that was connected to the whole program, right? To have codes established, housing codes for safety and sanitation and all that. And so he and others were derisively termed by conservatives muckrakers. All the muck, all the mud and the ugliness, they raked it all up for everybody to see. And of course, it was deliberate. It was strategic. They wanted to create a sense of indignation, of righteous anger over some type of injustice that was going on, so that people would put enough pressure on their elected reps to bring about legal changes that did away with those problems. So you had muckrakers who wrote about the abuses in factories and the conditions of labor, right? Like Upton Sinclair. You had people who wrote about the abuse of power of the railroads in particular, like Standard Baker. You had people who wrote about the corruption of senators at this time. I can't remember who it was, but there was a lot of stuff on the Senate's corruption. And so the list went on with one exposed, injustice after another. And they oftentimes they were addressed legally. Oh, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. All right. So you had Hazen Pingree, a mayor of Detroit. He confiscated land from businesses guilty of white-collar crime and allocated that land to the homeless. Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, a senator there. He wanted to legally strengthen workers' unions, regulate big business, provide free access to water, electricity, and public transportation. Okay. And by the way, that last one, they call that gas and water socialism, right? There's a guy named Hiram Revels here in California that was pushing for that as well, whereby they say that, okay, if you want a Cadillac, well, if you can't afford one in a capitalist country, then too bad, right? It's a free open market. You could either come up with the money or you can't. But when it comes to something like transportation, water, electricity, and those types of basic things, including to some people, medical care, that ought to fall under a human right rather than a capitalist privilege, like a Cadillac. And that therefore those things ought to be provided for free to the people. Now, the problem with that is, right, is when you provide these, they call safety net legislation, right, to help the less fortunate, including, right, mandated laws for minimum wages went through multiple states. Workers' compensation, if you got hurt at the job, they couldn't fire you anymore, but had to pay you workers' comp, etc. That money has to come from somewhere. So what they devised was a progressive or graduated tax rate, whereby they the higher they put things in brackets like we have today, especially here in California, and the higher bracket you're in, the higher percentage that you pay. And of course, that to this day is controversial, right? Because everyone understands that 12% of 3 million is a lot more taxed than 12% of 70,000 a year from someone making it with 70,000. But when you say, okay, no, the person paying 70,000 is only going to pay, this percentage, and the person making 3 million is going to pay a higher percentage, that was more controversial for the time, right? Because we've had a long history of a political tradition that has stressed meritocracy. You get what you merit, you get what you earn, what you work for. And so the conservatives, right, to this day, they feel like they're being punished for their success, that they're working their bottoms off to make more money, only to have a higher percentage of that money taxed from them as seeming punishment for their success. And so at any rate, that was the beginning of that issue. So, but going back to the progressives, the large interpretation, the court history of the progressives is that they were well-meaning, altruistic do-gooders, that they genuinely wanted to improve the world. They wanted to help those who couldn't help themselves. They wanted to resolve these injustices that were going on at their time. And it was just that. And then revisionist historiography came around by the 1960s in the history books. And like with people like Richard Hofstadter, who said, wait a minute, these upper middle class people, for one, there's evidence of envy of big business. Big business started to eclipse them, getting coverage in the newspapers, being invited to the local boards of commerce, getting their names on Time and their faces on Time magazine, and not to mention making a lot more money than the old middle class who constituted the lion's share of the reformers. So maybe there's a bit of envy here, of jealousy, whereby they made a villain out of big business because they resented big business and its success. And then another interpretation is that they were afraid of literally getting caught in the middle of a class war. That when they saw the Pullman strike happen and things like that, that they thought to themselves, my goodness, if we don't do something to give these poor people hope for improving their lives, they're going to rebel. There's going to be a class revolution on our hands. And we are just well-to-do enough to go under along with the wealthy, along with the big business. So hence they didn't want that. So they wanted to feed hope to these people. And then in also feeding them hope, revisionists have contended that they were also trying to control them, right? And trying to get them to kill their own cultures and become more like them, the reformers themselves. All right. So that's kind of my overview of the progressive movement. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Let's see here. So I'm just going to read through this, okay? The progressive movement, as carried out in Southern California, displayed evidence of a xenophobic fear undergirding it just as much as altruism. So remember, xenophobia is fear of anything that is outside your realm of familiarity. So basically, it's most of the time used in terms of fear of people of different nationality, of different ethnicity. And then just as much as altruism is putting others above yourself and actually doing like a good deed. Insecurities indigenous to California and the United States elicited this xenophobic fear displayed by Southern California's progressive leaders. So a pretty straightforward thesis, right? Is that during the progressive era, there was just as much xenophobia demonstrated toward Latinos as there was altruism in trying to actually help them. Granted, progressive impulses spread to Southern California. For instance, in 1917, Los Angeles voters approved a local ordinance eliminating saloons and restricting alcoholic beverages to beer and wine. Uber progressive politician Hiram Johnson came to power there, opposing large corporate power, primarily in the form of opposition to powerful railroad corporations and support for minimum wage laws, workmen's compensation, and restrictions on child labor. Okay, so that happened here in California, right? And this should sound familiar, right? Those are all things in line with the progressive reform. In 1913, the Commission of Immigration and Housing was established primarily to investigate immigrants' working and living conditions with the intention of legislating healthy criteria. In addition to assisting Southern California immigrants with acquiring their physical needs, the CIH leader, Simon Lubin, planned a reciprocal relationship with the immigrants, in which they were to receive physical aid and be taught the English language, while Los Angeles authorities and people were to derive benefits from their immigrant gifts. Okay, such a give and take exchange of cultural gifts, however, was sadly not to be. Conservative opposition turned the CIH and progressive movement in Southern California in a more xenophobic direction, hence my thesis. Regarding the CIH program, for example, progressive intellectual Elwood Cubberley of Stanford wrote, "Our task is to break up these groups or settlements, to assimilate and amalgamate these people as part of our American race, and to implant in their children, so far as can be done, the Anglo-Saxon conception of righteousness, law and order, and popular government." Okay, so wow, that says a lot. The CIH even won the collaboration of railroad companies that offered railroad boxcars to Americanization teachers who tried to teach the English language and instill middle-class Protestant values into the Mexican immigrant laborers. In 1915, the Home Teacher Act employed teachers to work in the homes of the pupils, instructing children and adults. Leading intellectuals like Dr. Emory Bogardus of USC emphasized tactically assimilating the mothers, as they were the key to socializing their children, the second generation, who didn't have old national habits to break. Okay. Look at this. But such mothers were not simply perceived as a means to an end, their children's assimilation. California progressives began to push for their employment outside their homes. They reported that many Mexican immigrant men wanted their wives to stay home as housewives, not for self-cultivation and access to the American dream, but to serve as necessary exploited laborers in dead-end jobs opening up in new California industries. So hence that they didn't do it for the right reason. They did it because they needed someone to do the jobs no one else wanted to do, like criadas, right? Like the housemaids. So why the xenophobic turn for California progressivism? Sources of fear plagued Americans. Firstly, the 1910 revolution in Mexico generated a mass exodus from that country to the U.S. Over 1 million immigrated here during the Mexican Revolution. At this time in Southern California, most residents were Anglo-Midwestern migrants themselves, which arguably made them feel insecure about their title to the leading demographic. As Mexican immigrants quickly became the leading foreign-born group in the state, Anglo parents complained of race suicide, Mexican immigrants dwarfing Anglo-Americans in production of children, and of Mexican students spreading diseases in the schools. Labor unions complained that Mexican immigrants were taking Anglo's jobs, being willing to work for less money, and Californians even feared Mexican imposition of radical beliefs and even the eventual reimposition of the Mexican flag over the state. So all kinds of fears are running rampant. As for fear of the latter, the Mexican consulate constantly organized festive events for people of Mexican heritage in Los Angeles. Spanish-written newspapers quickly arose in the city. Mexican expatriates visibly lionized or made a hero of. Revolutionaries like Emiliano Zapata, who advocated redistribution of property, and the widely read Flores Magón brothers, radicals who fled from Porfirio Diaz into Texas, called all Mexicanos to a worldwide anarchist revolution. So supposedly all these things and factors were causing the Anglo Californians in the progressive era to fear the Mexicans. All right. And remember, in the revolution, Porfirio Diaz ruled for like 30-something years over Mexico, and he's finally chased out. And it looked as if the military was going to unite with the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia was led by Francisco Madero, and the military was led by Victoriano Huerta. They combined forces, and Madero took over. He declared a more constitutional federal republic. He called for elections, popular elections. He did everything right, according to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson loved the guy. But then all of a sudden, Victoriano Huerta institutes a coup, C-O-U-P, a blow to the state. He overthrows his own leader, Madero, and has Madero executed. Okay. And in doing that, the United States is going to invade Mexico at Veracruz. He was warned by Wilson, as if it's Wilson's prerogative to dictate to Mexicans what they do with their government, right? But at any rate, he warned them. He said, release Madero and have free elections. If the people of Mexico want Madero, then he has a right to be the leader. And instead, he had him killed. And so then you had another incident by Veracruz, whereby American naval guys had issues with their battle frigate, and they had to stop for repairs. And they were arrested, beaten. Some were tortured by Huerta's men. So he sent a Marine expedition into Veracruz to punish Huerta. And so then that was Woodrow Wilson's first incursion or invasion of Mexico as their northern neighbor president. And then in addition to that, he was trying to bet on winning horses, basically, because after that happened with Madero, then no one would recognize Huerta as the leader. And so now you had a guy named Venustiano Carranza from Coahuila. You had Pancho Villa from Chihuahua. You had Emiliano Zapata from Morelos. And all of them were trying to form their own new government over Mexico. And they were known locally as caudillos, Caudillo. A caudillo is like a local political leader who rules by his own private resources and by the strength of his own charisma and natural leadership capacity. So at any rate, Mexico is going to devolve into a bloody war as these gentlemen are going to fight it out with one another over who's going to reign supreme over Mexico and whose plan for the country is going to prevail. Well, at one time, Wilson was helping Pancho Villa, but he supposedly saw that Carranza was going to win. He just had too many resources at his disposal. So he wanted to bet on the winning horse. So he retracted his help in giving arms and guns and help to Pancho Villa, and he continued to give it to Carranza, his enemy. Well, Carranza defeated Pancho Villa in a pivotal battle, and Pancho Villa, dejected and angry and blaming the United States government and their failure to continue to support him for his failure to defeat Carranza. And so he attacked Columbus, New Mexico, the town just across the border. He supposedly was just going for the military fort, but people came out of their homes in that town to take on his Mexican cavalry. And he ended up killing over 20 American citizens. And so then at that point, Woodrow Wilson, for a second time, is going to order an invasion of Mexico. And it's crazy, right? Because Woodrow Wilson, his administration is riddled with contradictions. That so much of what he did as president during World War I and all this was very reactionary, very uber conservative, right? In the name of safety and the well-being and all that. He's willing to crush individual liberties, etc. It's crazy because he was a Princeton professor in New Jersey, and he was Mr. Liberal himself. He was Mr. Progressive himself in his campaigns running for president. But he's just one of those presidents, along with Thomas Jefferson, that has a big gap, a big contradiction between what he practiced and what he preached. All right. So speaking of which, during World War I, the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, they declared that our involvement in World War I was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, right? That these leaders throughout the world, in Europe mainly, had their own greed, their own egos locked in to fighting over colonies, right? To fighting over these colonial possessions, so that the common person who had nothing to do with their own personal ambitions of their leaders had to go do the fighting, the killing, and the dying on the battlefield on their behalf. World War I is really going to enhance the popularity of the far left, right? Those kind of Marxist organizations that wanted an end to the plutocratic rule of the wealthy capitalists of all the leading countries, and redistribute land and give according to need to the common worker, the common member of the proletariat. It got a lot of credence, a lot of followers during World War I. There was a mutiny among the French. There was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia. There were mutinies in the German armed forces, and there were some mutinies in the U.S. as well. Okay, the poor soldiers, tired of fighting for the rich, powerful leaders. So at any rate, you have incidences that I go over of sabotage, etc. There was a guy named Carl Schenck, and he contended, don't join the draft, but if you use your weaponry, use it against the government instead. And he was arrested and fined, and he took it all the way to the Supreme Court, claiming his First Amendment right to freedom of expression. And the Supreme Court did not side with him. They took a conservative stance and said that if your words create an environment of clear and present danger, then you cannot write or speak those words. So to this day, right, you can't yell bomb as a joke on an airplane. and create an environment of clear and present danger for everybody. So it was a conservative administration, okay, from a so-called progressive administration. And so hence all this, I'm contending, created a sense of angst, of fear, and also of xenophobia. There was this great fear of the Germans when we went to war against them in World War I. You look at our patriotic leagues, you can look at their rhetoric, you can look at their posters, you can look at the War Industries Board, and the what else? There's the War Industries Board that helped fund the fight. But no, there was another one in charge of the propaganda. And I should have it here somewhere. The CPI, the Committees on Public Information. Okay, they basically were propaganda machines. And they called the Germans the Huns. Okay, like that group, that Asiatic group that came at the fall of Rome. Okay, and helped take down the Roman Empire. So at any rate, amidst this environment, labor union leader Samuel Gompers sought immigration restrictions for Mexico. Neighborhood organizations made covenants not to sell or rent to Mexicans. Japanese and Mexican labor unions and strikes received no support, and Anglos failed to support Mexican public displays of protest concerning San Angelo, Texas's decision to segregate Mexican students in its public school. Squeezed, Anglo-Americans turned xenophobically inwardly. So when you read the progressives, the assignment before this one that I just went over, it may have given you hope before I got to this next assignment. Like, okay, they're going to help the less fortunate. They're going to help provide them jobs. They're going to go out of their way to, to try to help give them hope, right? But then when you look at Mexican Americans in California during this same time period, it seems like they got the negative facets of the time without much of the positive. All right, so are there any questions? Right. So do you guys mind? Are we good to go? Okay, good. Thank you, Kimberly. I had one more name I didn't see here. I want to make sure I have everybody. Thank you, Dulce. Okay, I have everyone. All right, you guys have a good day, okay? Have a good week. Good luck with these. That last one, it's not on. I'll probably put it on tonight, okay? It's from like the 4th to like the 9th of November. You have to do it. All right, you guys take care, okay?
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too, Dulce. Thank you, hon.